We are all dealt a bad hand in life. For all of us at different times, life goes sideways. It can be the loss of a loved one. It could be the loss of a dream. But with that loss comes a cocktail of emotions, anger, sadness, pain, resentment, despair, all swirling together into one big, confusing storm. What do I do with this? How can I go on? This wasn't supposed to happen. I do a meditation where I try to release the anger that I am holding on to. And when I do it, I really have to go searching for that anger. It's so far down there. It's so repressed. And I carry it with me. I find that I've been carrying that unresolved pain and overwhelming sadness, that grief. I've been carrying it with me. I know that I will get dealt a bad hand in life again. But I'm not so sure that I know how to grieve. Welcome to Exploring Grief. This is a special 4-part series brought to you by the Catching Your Breath podcast. My name is Brandon Carleton. I am a pastor, an author, a podcaster, a fellow traveler on this journey of grief. If you're a regular listener of the Catching Your Breath podcast, by now you've probably noticed that I am not your usual full of Southern charm host, Steve Austin. I might throw a y'all your way every now and then, or should I say a y'all's way. But that is probably about as Southern as I will get. Yeah, Steve is taking a small break from the podcast, and I had been preparing this content on grief, so I hit up Steve and I asked him if he would be game if I did a 4-episode series, and he was kind enough to welcome me to the podcast. This topic of grief is very special to me. It's very close to me. Grief has been a central topic of my life over the last few years. I lead a community in Rock Island, Illinois, and grief is something that as a group we often discuss and explore, talk about. And one thing that I've learned is that grief is one of those things that often goes overlooked until it is too late. We avoid grief. We put it off. We don't grieve the small things in life. And then eventually it all catches up to us. And there's this big life event that happens and we're not ready for it. And we haven't worked out those muscles that we need to know how to go through the grieving process in a healthy way. We put it off, and that grief keeps piling up, and all that hurt and that sadness and that resentment, we carry it with us, and we carry it into every relationship, into our workplaces. We carry it with us when we go to the grocery store. Everywhere we go, we carry with us that unresolved grief. And I can't make this clear enough. This is not just about losing the life of a loved one. We need to be grieving all kinds of losses that happen in life. The loss of our job, for example, or the end of a friendship. I just had to get rid of my car, and I needed to grieve that. It can really be any loss. There are so many things that we need to grieve, but instead we're holding on to it and we're carrying that with us. So that is what this series is about. We're going to explore grief. Where might it be hiding? Why do we so easily put it off? Why do we so often avoid it? Why aren't we over that thing by now that we thought we should be over? So, a quick look ahead. In episode 2, we are going to interview my friend Sarah. And guys, I cannot wait for you to meet Sarah. Sarah started the Beautiful Project, and that's a beautiful with two L's, beautiful. And part of that project is her podcast called Beauty the Interviews. And in her current season, season 2, she has been interviewing trauma survivors. So in episode 2, we're going to sit down and talk with her and ask her about what she has learned about grief through these interviews. And I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. In episode 3, we're going to examine a letter that was written by Ram Dass. The backstory there is that there was a couple who had a daughter, and the daughter passed away unexpectedly, and Ram Dass wrote them a letter. And there is no real true like blueprint, right, for how to respond to grief. But I'm telling you guys, this letter, it comes pretty close to being that blueprint. So in episode 3, we're going to take a look at that letter. In episode 4, we're going to take a look at what life might look like post-grieving. And not that grieving ever truly ends, but we're going to take a look at what a new normal life might look like in episode 4. In this episode, we are going to quickly look at 3 factors of our lives that I believe have contributed to our poor grieving skills. I think we reach adulthood very underprepared or unequipped to grieve. So we're going to look at why that might be the case. Each episode will also include a small, simple, practical tip, some sort of concrete takeaway to help us in the grieving process. And then also each episode is going to include a poem on grief that I will read. And it'd be something meaningful, I think, for us to reflect on each episode. Before we jump in, I think it's really important for me to be clear and say that I am not a doctor. I'm not here to diagnose you. I'm not here to heal you. And listen, if you feel you need it, and actually, even if you don't feel like you need it, I cannot recommend enough seeing a professional grief counselor or therapist, or even attending a group therapy class on grief. Again, I am not a doctor. I'm simply here to explore the topic with you and maybe gain a slightly better understanding of grief, right? It's this absolutely foggy, dark, confusing mystery. And so that's what I'm here to do, is explore it with you, not to diagnose you or anything like that. Okay, so we are going to start out by taking a bit of a step back, by zooming out a little and asking, why is it that we are so bad at grieving? Why does it feel like we have this poor foundation, this poor skill set? So I want to take a look at 3 facets, 3 factors of American life, because that's the only one I know. 3 factors that I believe have affected us and our ability to grieve. And here are the 3 factors. 1, capitalism. 2, religion. And 3, the way that our brains are wired. I think that from a very young age, all 3 of these things have worked together to set us up to have a very poor foundation for grieving. And if you have ever beat yourself up, like I have, about not being good at grieving, hopefully by the time I'm done, in the next 10, 15 minutes, hopefully you can understand a bit better why grieving is so hard, why it doesn't come naturally to us. So I want to begin by talking about capitalism. And I know it might seem weird to start a grief podcast by talking about capitalism, but bear with me. And also, uh, before I get started, let me say, please, that this is not a political podcast. That's not the point here. I'm not trying to make an argument for or against capitalism. So please don't tune me out or turn me off. There's just no getting around the fact that we live in a capitalist country and that it's going to affect the way that we see and operate in the world around us. Capitalism shapes our paradigm, it shapes our approach to some very, very important aspects of our life. So that's why we're talking about it. And the two aspects that I want to take a look at are one, how there is no room for weakness in capitalism, and two, I want to look at how capitalism isolates us. So, number one, in capitalism, weakness is not allowed. All things around loss are looked down upon in capitalism. Growth, increase, success, winning, these are all good things, right? And then decrease, shrinking, failure, loss, these are all bad things. They're all sort of forbidden fruit in the world of capitalism. They are to be avoided at all costs. And here's the thing is loss, it's going to happen, right? Loss does happen. And then capitalism trains us to respond to that loss in very unhealthy ways. We aren't trained to properly grieve those losses. So, for example, picture a business person who maybe made a bad investment and lost a lot of money. You don't hear that person's employer say, "Wow, I'm really sorry. How can I help you during this tough time? How can I sit alongside you as you, process this loss?" You don't hear that. Instead you hear, you need to be better. You need to, quickly move on. You need to bounce back. You need to take it on the chin. This idea of your failure in that instance means that you need to improve and need to grow and need to be better. That means that how you are right now is not as a quote unquote loser, as someone who has experienced a loss. uh, that means that that is not acceptable. That is what we are trained to understand about ourselves in capitalism, is that losing is not acceptable, that we are at fault, that we are flawed somehow when we lose. And what are the kind of things that you hear, right? Like I said, take it on the chin, bounce back. We're taught to, analyze the loss so we can leverage it, to learn from it so next time we don't lose. And so we take this mentality and we transfer it to our lives. When we lose, we feel like there's something wrong with us, right? But also in our relationships, for example, let's say someone close to us passes away. The first place we often go is we ask the question, how can I learn from this loss to make sure that it doesn't happen again? How can I make sure that I don't get hurt again? And unfortunately, a lot of times the answer to that question, at least at the beginning, sometimes we work our way through this, but the initial response is, the answer is, to not let anyone get close again, right? Uh, we try to move on quickly and we try to bounce back. We feel guilty for taking a long time to grieve. Well, it's not even a long time. We just any amount of time is too long in the capitalistic model, right? We say those things like, I feel like I should be over it by now. So that's number one. Losing and weakness isn't allowed in capitalism. Number two is that capitalism isolates us. And here's the thing. I'll use two quick examples, but the more successful you are within capitalism, the more alone you are. So let's look at housing, and then let's look at transportation. And both of them are this spectrum. They both exist on the spectrum of having people around you to on one side of the spectrum, all the way over to the other side of the spectrum of being alone. So, housing, for example, when you don't make very much money, where do you often live? You live in an apartment. Um, and when you live in an apartment, you usually have lots of neighbors. I'm in an apartment right now. You might even hear someone walking in the apartment above me or the outside door slam. I have neighbors below me, above me, to the both sides of me. And then there's one, two, three, four, five, six different apartment buildings I can see from my window right here. I am not alone. I have lots of neighbors. But as you progress on this spectrum and you start to make more money and you start performing better in this capitalism model, what's the next step? You buy a house. But that first house, maybe, it's small and you're tripping over each other. You're tripping over, there's not a lot of room for your family, but at least you have neighbors still, right? There may be fewer neighbors, but they're still close neighbors. That is, until you save up and you buy a fence, and now you don't have to see those neighbors, right? But then you progress down this spectrum, and now maybe you got a raise, and you can buy a bigger house with neighbors that are further away. You have less neighbors, and then maybe you make a lot of money, and now you have a really big house with a private gate, and you can be in two opposite corners of the house, and you wouldn't even know that your family or that someone else's home. You're not tripping over each other anymore, right? So that's kind of a spectrum of as you make more money, you can start to get more and more isolated. And it's the same thing with transportation. You usually start out on some sort of public transportation, like you're on a crowded bus or on a train, and then you get a car. But you're in the car, but now you're stuck in traffic, right? Now, what's the furthest end of that extreme is you're flying private, and you get to skip the crowds and the lines at the airport, and you're flying by yourself. You are more isolated. Capitalism is also isolating because there's a scarcity mindset. It's this idea that there's not enough to go around. So you hoard. You keep your time, your money, your resources, you keep them to yourself. You don't want to share. And if you're not sharing, you're actively trying to keep people away from you in a sense. So that isolates you. So that is how I see capitalism giving us a poor skill set for grieving. But now let's move on to religion. And listen, I get it. Not everyone grew up religious, but I do think if you live in America, religion is going to affect your life. It makes up a part of the fabric of society. Uh, and so, hearing these things might still be beneficial. And to be clear, also before I start, I'm talking about my Western evangelical Protestant Christian experience. And there are two different ways that I see my religious upbringing and how it affected my grieving skills. And get this, these two ways, they might sound a little familiar. Here are the two ways I see the church affecting my grieving skills. One is that in the church, there is no room for weakness. Does that sound familiar? And then two, in the church, the church actually has a weird way of isolating us. That also might sound familiar. Okay, so the first one, there's no room for weakness in church. So oftentimes, if you express the emotions that come with grieving, emotions like sadness, pain, hurt, depression, you know, there can be a stigma around those emotions. And it'll be, kind of communicated to you in various ways, both implicit and explicitly, that you have a weak faith for feeling sad or depressed. And I have to say, of course, the people who say that are flat out wrong. I need to be clear about that. But unfortunately, a lot of times that is the unspoken kind of subtext or attitude or perception, is that if you're sad, you have a weak faith. You need to have a stronger faith. There's a lot of this like quickly jumping to the silver lining when life doesn't go well. Oh, God has plans for you. You need to trust in God. Like, God is testing you. Stay faithful. There's very little, I'm sorry that you're going through this right now. How can I be here for you during this tough time? How can I sit alongside you during this season of loss? There's none of that. There's a lot of, you need to pray more. You need to read your Bible more. You need to have a stronger faith. And a good example, actually, is how the Protestant church handles Easter weekend. The focus is on celebrating, right? It's on winning, uh, being successful, you could say. The focus is on the success of Sunday morning and the Easter weekend. There's very little focus on all of the losing and the pain, the sadness and the grief that goes into and is definitely present on the Friday and Saturday of Easter weekend. But none of those emotions get very much airtime at all. There's just a lot of focus on celebrating. The second way that the church often affects our grieving abilities is that the church has this weird way of isolating us. And the church isolates us because, and this is almost every church I've ever been to, and I've been to lots, right? Whenever I was there, I felt like I couldn't be my authentic self because, being sad or being depressed, like I said, isn't allowed. So that means that we have to fake being happy. Maybe you can think of a time you've attended church and someone asked you, "Hey, how are you doing today?" Did you really feel like you could be honest with them? Or did you feel like you had to plaster a smile on your face and say, "I'm doing great," or "I'm feeling blessed"? And so, listen, if there is no authenticity, if there's no vulnerability, then there's just no real connection happening between you and that other person, right? It's that classic, you can be in a crowded room but still feel alone type of scenario. So, both capitalism and the church have trained us to think, one, that there's just no room for weakness, and then two, they've also kind of pushed us towards isolation. And we take both of those things into our own personal lives and we apply them to the way that we handle our grief. And the last thing I want to talk about now is how our brains are wired around trauma. And I'm going to talk quickly about this. Like I said, I'm not a doctor. I'm not definitely not a neurologist. I'm not a brain expert. But through processing my own grief, I've learned a way that our brains are wired. And so the first thing that our brains try to do, almost always, once when the trauma is fresh, we try to find a logical explanation for why the trauma happened. We try to replay the events surrounding the trauma to try to kind of crack the code, so to speak, to try to solve the problem of why did this happen. And that because if we can solve it, if we can figure out why it happened, this is our brain kind of doing its job in a sense. If we can figure out why it happened, then we can stop it from happening again. But here's the thing that I really want to talk about. And listen, doing this, trying to solve and figure out why it happened, it's only natural. It does not mean you're a bad person. It does not mean you are doing grief wrong. That is really just the natural inclination of our minds. Here's the thing though, whenever we are in that process, whenever our mind is replaying the events of the day, things like that, it's actually taking our mind off of our grief. It's taking our mind off of how much it hurts, which is sometimes frankly, just a really is a necessary reprieve. We need a break from thinking about how much it hurts, right? Uh, but if we're not careful, we think that the way to heal is by solving the problem and not by addressing our hurt and our pain and our grief and our resentment and things like that, right? Trying to solve the problem, trying to put the pieces together of why what happened did in fact happen takes us away from thinking about our wound. And if we're not careful, we repress that wound. We repress and push down all of that grief, and we never come back to it. So the point of me bringing this up isn't to say, don't let your brain go there. Don't try to figure out why what happened did happen. It's not that. Just being aware of the fact that our solution, our healing is not going to be wrapped up in figuring it out. Healing comes through sitting in our grief, looking at it. You're going to hear this phrase next episode. The only way out is through. We can't avoid it. If we repress it, it's just going to come back at a different point in time. And we talk about this next episode too in my interview with Sarah. So I'm not going to go into it too much here. But yeah, this way that our brains like to work of trying to solve the problem, it's only natural. There's nothing wrong with it. But be aware of it and be aware of when you're using it as a way to not have to think about how much you're hurting. So those are the three things: capitalism, the church, and a little bit about how our brains are wired. I think those three things, really they set us up to not be good at grieving. Okay, so this is now the part of the episode where I give you some sort of practical tip or tool to help you in the grieving process. It's meant to be some sort of, like a very small little nudge. And you might hear this and think, you know what, I'm not ready for this yet. And that is okay. Do this when you are ready. It's okay if you never do this. And also, there's no guarantee. This isn't a magic pill by any means. That's not what these are meant to be. They're not supposed to just make everything immediately better, right? It's just a small little tool or tip. So this episode's tip is to write a thank you note. And you don't even have to send it if you don't want to. Um, that's up to you if you want to send it. I think sending it would be beautiful, but you don't have to send it. Take a look around you and see who has been there for you. Maybe a nurse, maybe a coworker, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's just a friend who has, you know, every other day or so or whatever has just sent you a text message checking in on you. Has there been anyone who has kind of stepped up during this crisis and shown that they love you? If there is, write them a thank you note. When we go through the grieving process, especially when the trauma is fresh, there's just so much hurt and pain and sadness. There's not very many emotions like joy or happiness or gratefulness. And so this exercise of writing a thank you note in a way is kind of just a reprieve. It's giving yourself permission to be grateful, even if it's just for 10 minutes. You can return back. This doesn't have to be a betrayal to your pain. You can return back to that sadness once you're done writing the thank you note. But just try experiencing a new emotion, one you maybe haven't felt in a while. Just give yourself permission to experience that emotion, to feel grateful, just as long as you write the note. And then, like I said, you can go back if that's what you need to do. But yeah, so that's the practical tip for this episode. Try writing a thank you note. So now we are going to move into one of my favorite parts of these episodes, which is the reading of a poem. I'm trying to capture grief is so difficult to put it into words, which is why good authors and good poets can be so helpful. They deal so much in metaphor and symbolism and imagery, and they really they find a way. Sometimes these really difficult things, the only way to talk about them is in metaphor. You could talk about them logically. We kind of talked about this with the way our brains are wired. When you approach it logically, a lot of times it's hard to understand it. But if we can maybe come at it from the angle of a metaphor or symbolism, things can start to make sense. So this poem is from Tori. Their Instagram account is at Notes on the Way. And the name of this poem is called Love in a Peach Pie. Thank you, Tori, for writing these words. It's an ache in the soul, the leaving. It is a gutting, lonely letting go, a growl in the stomach, a cloud in the eyes. I've been there too. But what you can't see now is this: the breaking of light about to lick the horizon, showing off its peaches and cream morning just for you, folding you in to the sweet pie of a fresh young day, warm and honeyed and made to share. There, in that delicious dawn, wait, with gentle hands and open arms, people who love you, who love you, who love you. Some old, some new, some unexpected entirely, all grateful and eager to partake in the heavenly mess you bring to the table, where you will be nourished again. I could sit with that poem all day, all week. But that does it for episode 1 of Exploring Grief. Like I said, my name is Brandon Carleton. You can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. The easiest way to find me is probably my website, which is meaningfulagain.com. On Twitter, my handle is at BC the Heretic. On Instagram, I'm Brandon Carleton CC. And if you want to find me on Facebook, I'd be happy if you befriended me. I'm also in the Catching Your Breath community, the closed Facebook group that Steve has started, if you want to join that. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and thank you to Steve for this platform. Talk to you in episode 2.